And hello on this cold winter night. So cold that it's even cold in Texas, believe it or not. Relatively speaking, everything's relative. Well, it is 35 degrees here, half an hour south of Dallas, and it's going to be 25 degrees before the night is over. Excuse me, just ate dinner. So, but you folks up north, where I'm from, oh, Dave, rub it in, why don't you? Well, the wildfires aren't good, but 65 degrees. Yeah, up north it's probably a lot colder where Scott Thomas is, or where I'm from, or but I've got two cats. Scott, I just texted you this. You guys can't see, but actually I'm gonna try and okay. I don't know if you can see my right there anyway are my two cats. And let's see if we can do this. I don't know if the light will be good enough, but check that out. So Jupiter was up here laying on my coat, and Monty decided that he was lonely and wanted to join Jupiter. That is just so cute. They are really becoming brothers. So, Jupiter is 90% an inside cat now, Dave. Um, I've been pushing it because it is winter, and I would, not have pushed it so quickly, but I don't want him to freeze. As far as the outdoor cats go, we bought a kind of a cat house. Logan put it together, and you plug it in, and the floor of it is heated. And it was kind of expensive. I think it was like 60 or 70 bucks, but I couldn't not do it. Um, Now I just gotta get the cats in there. So, anyway, the weather is perfect for listening to a horror story, right? For reading them. So, who we got here? Dave. Dave, Marianne, Alan, Mark, and there's more that haven't spoken up yet, and that's fine. You don't have to. Anyway, I sent a text to Scott Thomas earlier today and asked him if I could read a story of his. And I'm going to read from Over the Darkening Fields, which someday in the next year or two, when I can get to it, Scott and I are publishing a Kindle version of this, and hopefully introducing the book to a whole new readership. But I realized Scott. I think Scott is watching live. Yeah, Scott and Sarah. Hey, Sarah. You leaving, Monty? All right, buddy. Thanks for being here, buddy. Good night and good luck. So anyway, it looks like I'm gonna need to read more than one. I forgot a lot of these are shorter stories, which is fine. They're exactly the length that they need to be. But Scott very graciously said that I could, and I've got my coffee here, my water. Thinking again of Pontypool, I pulled this up. Now, in our top story of today, a big, cold, dull, dark, white, empty, never-ending, blow my brains out, seasonal affective disorder freaking kill me now, weather front that'll last all day. Or maybe when the wind shifts later, we'll get a little greenhouse gas relief from the industrial south. So we're not going to be going to Ken and the Sunshine chopper tonight, though. We're just going to be reading horror stories. All right, so if you don't have this book, you should get it. And I'd like to get it on Kindle, not only to introduce it to a new audience, but so Scott can make some more money on this, because he deserves to. All right, so Scott, if it's not okay to read more than one, let me know. But I know you well enough that I think it probably is. So this one needs some light. This one is called the August Ritual. So here we go. By the way, how's everybody doing? Thanks for joining me tonight. All right, the August Ritual by Scott Thomas. Every August I go back to the cemetery, hoping to see something. People would think it strange if they saw me, lying on the hood of my car, propped against the windshield, gazing off into the night sky. My wife is starting to get used to the adventure, and I suspect she's growing fond of it too. Someday, I hope to have a child to bring to share these fleeting streaks of meteor light. It started with my Uncle John. He was a lovable sort, gray, gentle, and good-humored. Thank you, Sarah. He never lost his sense of wonder, and he urged me to appreciate the fine details of the world around me. Life was textures and smells and precarious temporary moments of magic around John. Adventure was never far off when I was small, and the world had yet to be demystified by the demands and concerns of adulthood. When I had the heart of a boy and was going to live forever. Back then, the worst thing that could happen was school. Worse than death, for that was too abstract, intangible. John was a magnet to adventure. Like the time we were driving past the reservoir and discovered a large snapping turtle sunning itself in the middle of the road. He stopped the car and got out, afraid that someone would come along and run over the poor beast. I climbed from the car and followed, hovering at a safe distance. The snapper's beaked head retracted, a prehistoric jack-in-the-box in reverse. Uncle Jack grabbed the creature's tail and dragged its hissing, sage-colored bulk back into the grass that bordered the water. Then there was the Sunday when we were hunting wild blueberries and a summer storm came pounding out of the west. We sheltered in a grove of maples at the edge of a field. The sky was gray fists and noise, and the wind and rain shook the trees so hard that leaves fluttered around us like frightened birds. I dropped my bag of berries and grasped John's hand, my invincible boy heart having second thoughts about mortality, until I looked up and saw the quiet smile on the old man's face. During the summers, back when I lived in Eastboro, I spent a good deal of time at the old fellow's place. He lived on the second floor of an old slate blue colonial beside the long tree, shaded entrance to the Catholic cemetery. There were few houses on the street. The residential section thinned, giving way to farmland. Though the busy center of town was little more than 5 minutes away, one had a sense of isolation. I remember a number of occasions when my uncle talked about that sad-looking young man. Every once in a while, John would look down from his kitchen window and watch a tall, gaunt man with morose features striding slowly out of the cemetery. It was invariably dusk. The fellow would travel the long paved path to where it met the street, then head off toward town. It was not uncommon for folks to stroll in the place. Lots of people appreciate the gentle park-like quality some cemeteries have. Funny, though, how John never saw the man entering the place, just leaving. Right, exactly. There was something mystical about venturing into the graveyard at night to watch for meteors. I remember the last time we went, it was mid-August, the time when the Earth was in viewing range of the Parside meteor shower. There was a clammy chill in the air and a spicy scent of damp sod. Summer could not have been far away. Darkness transformed the place, melting the boundaries, blurring them into misty clots of trees. The familiar tar roads I knew so well by daylight were ethereal mottlings of shadow and moonlight. The headstones were indistinct, and the place felt unnaturally spacious, open. Red lanterns close to the ground shone on marble monuments and blinked behind others. Distant trucks moaned along 495 as I clung to the comfort of Uncle John's big paw. There was a glass rotary where a life-size crucifixion statue loomed. I looked up at it as we passed, could just make out the scrawny limbs of a figure silhouetted against the moon's haze. At the back of the cemetery there was a field that stretched off into the distance. An opalescent layer of localized ground fog made it seem as if the field itself were turning into vapor. We stood beneath dark trees, looking out at a quartz-dappled sky beside a lone wooden post where a fence had been. The fence was gone, and at that moment it seemed other borders were indistinct, ephemeral. My vibrant child's imagination convinced me that if I were to wade out into that damp moon-luminous mist, I would slip into a realm of unfamiliar intangibility. "Look," Uncle John said, pointing toward the horizon. It was brief, a bronze smudge as debris burnt in the Earth's atmosphere. I clung to John's hand. The speed and brilliance of the thing accentuated the strangeness of its silence. I looked up at the man whose eyes were twinkling to defy the wrinkles. He wore a boyish smile. Other meteors followed, rewarding our patience, fleeting streaks, slashing tails. While I did not conceptualize, this is live. While I did not conceptualize at the time, I had a curious, fateful feeling about that night. There I stood, a young boy with an old man, in a graveyard by that lone ruin of a fence, meteors darting briefly, dying silently. I was recording a book, then I could rewind my mistakes and eliminate them, but we're all gathered around the virtual campfire, right? Mrs. Bell was a nice middle-aged widow who owned the house where Uncle John lived. She was the last to see him, except for that sad-looking young fellow who held John's hand as they walked off into the cemetery one August dusk. Every August I come back to watch the shooting stars, slashing quietly above the misted field. It's something of a ritual. Sometimes I wonder what I'll see there in the dark. I wonder, I shiver, and I smile. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. If you're late to the party, I'm reading a couple of stories from Over the Darkening Fields by Scott Thomas. You should get it if you haven't already. Or if you want to wait a few months to a year, I don't want to commit to a time frame, but it shouldn't be any longer than that. Scott and I will have a Kindle version for you if you're a Kindle person. So, happy Tuesday night. I guess it's pretty much cold almost everywhere, isn't it? All right, what else should I read here? Well, I can't pass up reading Winter Census, which is my favorite story in this collection. I've read it before, but maybe you haven't heard it. Excuse me. Actually, Winter Census fits perfectly on a night like tonight. That's a night that's so cold. Did they salt the streets of Waxahachie? I don't think they have salt, Davy. Um, I'm sure he did. No, I was going to read that, Sarah. But it's perfect for tonight, isn't it? Cold winter night. Give me a second and we'll start that one. You want to read, Jupiter? Jupiter said, "Don't bother me, I'm sleeping." All right, so to celebrate the winter, let's read Winter Census. All right, here we go. Winter Census by Scott Thomas. This isn't a story about the conventional horrors of homeless life. Not that I couldn't fill volumes with that stuff. But since you asked me for the most disturbing thing I've seen, I'll tell you. It was late December, and I was a volunteer with a group working for the mayor's office. It was an annual event. Our task was to go around the city and take a count of all of the homeless people we could find. It was only my second time, though I'd been involved with the shelters for several years, and I'd organized few food drives and things of that nature going back 9 or 10. I was accompanied by a young guy named Don, who was an EMT, and Father Ed Willard, a priest who had dedicated so much time and soul to looking after the disadvantaged that he had been written up in a national news magazine and had made a number of appearances on local television. We were quite the dedicated crew. The winter had been mild up until that night, generally speaking, though it's true what they say about New England weather. It can change in a flash. It's best not to get complacent even with a long stretch of merciful temperatures. It can drop down to a wind chill of 30 degrees below faster than you could say hypothermia. That night, we got the first real wintry stuff of the season. It was bitter cold and snowing pretty good. Windy, too. A ragtag army of vehicles spread out to explore the city, armed with flashlights and blankets. I don't mind telling you that the census adventure could be frightening at times. We would venture into some pretty rough areas, and there were some scary characters around. Ever drive through Roxbury after dark? I think if I were to go again, I'd want to carry a gun, especially after that night. It didn't take us long. They were huddled in doorways, in alleys, in places you wouldn't believe. People can get pretty creative and fit their bodies into some strange places in order to get out of the cold. We had to joke to keep each other's spirits up because the tragedy factor was so profound. I remember an old lady we found curled upon a grid to catch the heat that came up. She had a flattened refrigerator box over her head, and snow had coated it. She was clinging to an old beat-up stuffed dog toy, and her coat pockets were filled with empty bottles. She seemed to be somewhat retarded. Images like this made me feel like murdering career welfare abusers. My tax dollars were doing nothing for that suffering old woman, while I'd known young breed-for-bucks mothers and smug young men who bragged about what a great country America was because, besides working a job, they benefited from food stamps and Medicare. One encounters a lot of injustice out on the streets. Don thought that the woman's breathing was bad and that she was a good candidate for frostbite. We decided to call an ambulance. Turns out she ended up losing a few toes. Well, I'll get to the point, seeing as it's getting kind of late. We had gone into the north end, where there were a good deal of old brick buildings. We parked, then crunched along on the snow, while flakes whirled down through the pink haze of the street lamps. Father Willard became concerned when he couldn't find a Vietnam vet named Reggie, who usually stayed in this particular indented area behind a building, between two dumpsters. "Hey," Don had said, "look at this." Don was pointing at what appeared to be drag marks, wide, as if someone had been pulled along the pavement on his back. We followed them out to the street and saw that they led to an alley which, due to the snow, was not as dark as it normally would have been. Don thought he saw someone extremely tall flit by the opening of the alley, but Father Willard said that Reggie was a very short man. We were starting over, squinting through the slanting snowfall, when we saw these three strobe-like flashes of red come from inside that alley. We ran. I was the first to see it. At the far end of the alley, where the strewn trash was smoothed over in gentle waves by the accumulated white, there was a blackened heap of steaming human bones. The stench was enough to make you sick. "Dear God," Father Willard said. "What the hell happened?" I asked, squinting down at the pieces that were stacked like so much kindling. "He must have built a fire to keep warm," Don offered weakly. I wondered how he could have burned down so thoroughly. I mean, there was no sign of scorched clothing, no suggestion of skin, muscle, or organs. There were only bones. "Maybe," Don conjectured, "someone killed him and set the corpse on fire." I nodded. In these days, when teenage kids were killing each other over sneakers and jackets, it was quite likely that someone would kill a poor homeless guy for kicks and then set him on fire. Hopefully, he was already dead before the flames were lit. Although this theory offered a reasonable explanation as to how the man was burned, It did not explain the high degree of incineration. "I'm going out to the car to phone the police," I said. I was halfway to the vehicle when I paused. I had just passed the opening of another alley when I saw a great shadow sweep across the snow in front of me. Even taking into account the fact that a shadow would have appeared stretched at such an angle, I determined that whoever made it would have to be over 7 feet tall. The silhouette showed a figure in a large cloak-like garment with a hood, carrying some type of staff. There seemed to be a wild crown of bare branches and twigs sticking up from the head, and fir branches tied to it so that they stuck out from the shoulders and wound around the sleeves. I was startled and only saw for a brief moment as this shadow passed. I spun around. The mouth of the alley was empty, but for the windy, fluttering snow. It was a long and bitter night. The snow continued to fall steadily until there were several inches. We had counted as many stray souls as possible before returning to our own safe homes, our cozy beds. Strangely enough, we not only tallied up the number of homeless, there was another count taken, a grim and perplexing one. For on that night, 12 sets of smoky, blackened human bones were found in the snow-haunted alleys of Boston. And that was Winter Census by Scott Thomas. What'd you think, Jupiter? Jupiter gave me 2 paws up. Yeah, if you like weird fiction, which you probably do if you're here, then you should pick up this book. These are all great stories, but that one is my favorite. Do you guys want me to read one more, or are we done? Oh, Sarah says, best reading yet, Scott said. Thanks, Scott. I'm getting better at narration. I hope. I think. Oh, Jakester says, read more, please. All right. Give me a second, and I will figure out which one. Let's see. Tell Scott, thank you for me, Sarah, please. Um, you know what? This one's a little bit longer than the other two, but this will be a great way to wrap up, I think. So this will take a few minutes. Uh, yeah, thank you, Scott. These are wonderful stories that you've given to the world, and Scott has other collections too. Um, just be aware. There's another Scott Thomas who's a writer on Amazon. So if it's not horror, it's probably not the real Scott Thomas. Right, Sarah? All right, let's read Halloween Tea, and this probably doesn't surprise Scott either. Uh, if you're just joining us, the name of the book is Over the Darkening Fields by Scott Thomas. And I'm going to read, for the last story tonight, I'm going to read Halloween Tea. Oh, I know what I was going to say, that Scott gave these stories to the world. Uh, Hopefully I'm doing them justice, but you got to remember, I'm just the performer here. Um, Scott put these out there. All right, Halloween Tea by Scott Thomas. October looked good on the old town, Audrey thought, meandering in her car, reacquainting herself with the memories which were Eastboro. The town had grown considerably since she was young, but there remained an abundance of New England charm that developers had not managed to spoil. While there were several shopping centers on the outskirts and numerous business structures looming along Route 9, down in the old town proper, autumn found a graceful haunt. Audrey's first stop was the cemetery. Her long, tan coat and auburn hair fluttered as she crunched up a hill overlooking adjacent farmland. There were more monuments than she recalled. The smallest of these, half submerged in fallen leaves beneath an ancient maple. She found the stone marked Emily and knelt. Fingers reached to gently brush the cool marble, and a tear fell to kiss the autumn's leafy cheek. She set a small pumpkin beside the stone and smiled sadly. "Happy Halloween," she whispered. Audrey rose and a soft wind breathed, the pooled leaves trembling. The sun passed behind the western horizon, where naked trees reared in dark tangles against the sky's milky bronze. "Hello?" It was an old woman's voice, a voice gone gray, straining as if muffled with webs. "Hi, Mrs. Howell. This is Audrey Putnam." There was a pause. "Audrey, dear. Good heavens, what a surprise, my dear." Audrey grinned. "It's so great to hear from you. Guess what? I'm calling from the Eastboro Inn." The old voice shed some of its webs. "You're in town. How nice. Why, I haven't seen you in so many years. Do you think you might find time to drop by?" "Absolutely, with one minor condition. You remember what we used to do every Halloween?" Mrs. Howe was hesitant. "Yes, we had a tea." "Well, I just happened to have two fat pumpkins here, and I was thinking maybe we could—" "Oh, Audrey, I'm so tired these days. I don't think I'm up for it. The place is such a mess and all. I haven't been well." Audrey's voice returned, patiently bright. "I think a Halloween tea would do you good. I'll do all the work." Mrs. Howe agreed reluctantly and hung up the phone. She sat in the dimness of her living room, amidst the shadows that smelled like old newspapers. She gazed over at the framed picture of a little girl with smile-sparked eyes and a hair of braided flax. The image was sun-faded, blurring to sepia. Sepia, I'm sorry. I just have trouble with sepia. Like a leaf turning. Audrey had been Emily's best friend. For years following the accident, Audrey had still come around. They had helped to heal one another, filling the chilled hollows of their hearts with warm cookies and jelly-soled tarts. There was iced tea in summer, when the sweat ran like tears, and laughter to fend off the winter's shrill dusk. They had shared long afternoons of talk and tea, carving their own brief traditions upon the rushing years, until even those gave way to the inevitability of distance. Audrey sought her dreams in a far-off state. Then there were only letters and cards, the occasional call. Hope you guys are enjoying this tonight, and I hope that I've made Scott a few more fans, hopefully. Mrs. Howe brushed the warm trickle from her cheek and headed for the kitchen. For long hours of the night she bustled, dusting off her pans and cookie sheets, once more filling dark corners with the warm aroma of baking. Then it was up into the creaky attic, wobbling amidst precarious heaps. A bare bulb rocked, and treacle shadows poured as she sought out her old boxes of Halloween treasures. She smiled, unraveling them, ceramic figures lovingly packed in crinkly newspaper shrouds, candles and cutouts like rediscovered friends. With so much to do, Mrs. Howe forgot how sickly she had been, how tired before Audrey's call. She spent much of the night whisking through the old house like an autumn breeze. It was well after midnight when something started scratching at the back door. Mrs. Howe put down the small plastic witch she'd been holding and was moving toward the kitchen when she suffered one of her spells. Dizziness came over her, and there was the strange burning in her chest, as if some small internal blotch of darkness ached to spread, gnawing her away to nothing. A trembling hand reached for the knob and pulled the door open. A leafy sigh of wind gushed into the kitchen as Mrs. Howe looked down at the doorstep. The breeze cooled the burning in her chest, and she smiled like a jack-o'-lantern at the sight of the fat black cat sitting there, grinning up at her. No, not you guys. You guys aren't fat. You certainly aren't fat, Jupiter. There was something in the air. It was more subtle than when Audrey had been younger, but it was still there, flitting leaf-like, fluttering bat-like through the rooms of her heart on a moon-frosted breeze. It was an anticipatory sensation that drew her like some ancient gravity. It beckoned to her with rattling cornstalk voices, singing cider perfume through leaf-sparse branches. Only one day a year she felt it, on the afternoon of October 31st, when all the world seemed to tilt toward the mystical night. Familiar streets passed through the woman's windshield. Most of the urgent colors had passed. Still, there were sporadic gushes of crimson and amber. The houses were old high things, some still enveloped in mantles of maple cadmium. Audrey could remember braving those stairs, standing in puddles of porch light as screen doors whined and towering adults chuckled down. Treats had rained into her hungry, chocolate-breathed bag. How the houses had loomed then, the streets stretching off, elastic charcoal murals, jack-o'-lanterns dappling, the smell of wood smoked ethereal and enticing. Coppery rays of afternoon sunlight were slanting through the trees when Audrey pulled up outside Mrs. Howe's house. The place looked tired, overgrown and weedy, but there was a thrill of familiarity, a ghost of coziness. Audrey carried a shopping bag full of goodies onto the porch, then went back to get the pumpkins. She knocked. The door opened. "Trick or treat!" Audrey exclaimed. They hugged. Mrs. Howe looked over the younger woman, who was in her mid-30s, pretty, with chocolate eyes and auburn hair. She wore a black skirt and a peach-colored sweater. Little gold skull earrings gleamed. Mrs. Howe was willowy gray, her eyes the blue of a September sky, still glinting from out of the bark-like creases of her flesh. She wore a long black gown and shawl. "Come in, come in." Candles lit the foyer like some initiatory tunnel leading into the heart of the season. Indeed, the place was something of a Halloween decoration museum or shrine. Mrs. Howe's extensive collection included rare and let me try that again, antiquated treasures, from old faded Denison cutouts to imported German-made papier-mâché vegetable spirits dating from 1900. A slender glass black cat, obviously a Deco-inspired work, seemed ready to pounce from the bookcase as they entered the living room. Audrey ducked between, excuse me, Audrey ducked beneath a brittle construction paper chain she and Emily had made in the 4th grade. The orange had faded to a dusty peach, and the black had gone gray. A ponderous cat waddled out of the shadows, rubbing against Audrey's ankles. "Basil!" She reached down to stroke the warm, purring blackness. They walked deeper into the living room, where a tape of low, rumbling organ music was playing. Audrey smiled, delighted. A ceramic skull sat on the table in a nest full of covered leaves, surrounded by plates loaded with pastries, cheeses, apples, and nuts. She wagged her head. "I thought you were too tired." "So did I," Mrs. Howe admitted. "It's lovely." Audrey glanced over at a picture of Emily dressed as a bunny, the picture frame carefully ringed in bittersweet. Something caught in her throat. "So," Mrs. Howe said, clapping her hands together, "where are those pumpkins?" They stood on the porch admiring their handiwork as purple saturated the dusk sky. The carved pumpkins flanked the door, bright tongues flickering behind lidless mouths, the freshly cut features beating with moisture. Audrey turned, looking up and down the street. They were already out, small figures rustling along shaded sidewalks, ectoplasmic sheets swaying, miniature witches giggling and shrieking. The October sun seemed to crackle as it died behind the skeleton trees. "I was reading about the history of Halloween," Mrs. Howe said, leaning on the porch railing, eyeing the last brassy glimmers. This night was New Year's Eve to the ancient Celts. They thought the old year died at sunset, and the new year didn't start until sunrise on November 1st. The period between was a timeless place where the dead returned. Audrey smiled, inhaling the leaves and wood smoke and candle-warmed pumpkins. She nodded. Mrs. Howe slumped forward, catching a porch beam for support. She put a hand to her chest and grimaced. Mrs. Howe, I'm all right, just a little dizzy. Audrey looked concerned, taking a step closer, taking the woman's frail arm. Shall we have tea, Audrey? Yes. Earl Grey with orange food coloring, old radio shows on the tape player, Arch Obler's Lights Out, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. Trick-or-treaters kicked through jaundiced leaves and knocked and chanted at the gourd-guarded door. Uh, prob- I'm sure we'd have been friends otherwise, but uh, Scott and I have this in common that we love those old-time radio shows, especially the horror ones. A lidded stew pot sat on a stove burner, the popcorn kernels inside kicking like rain on tin. Had there ever been such a magic night? The hours crept by. They sat by the fireplace as birch crackled in its flickering bed of flame, painting their shadows as long, ghastly things. Mulled cider followed the tea, and Mrs. Howe read M.R. James's "Oh, whistle and I'll come to you, my lad," with Basil curled humming in her lap. The candy hunters had retired to their own cozy abodes, and even the older pranksters had turned the streets over to the scurrying patrols of citrine leaves. The hours tickled as they reminisced. 1, 2, 3 in the morning. The pumpkins burned out, and a gentle drizzle fell. Audrey grew drowsy, slumped in her wing chair. The fireplace pulsed with coals, casting a serene glow on the picture of little Emily. The knock woke Audrey. Oh, I must have dozed off. Mrs. Howe set forward. I'll get it. Basil leaped down from the old woman's lap and climbed up onto Audrey. He purred as he always had, those many years ago, rubbing his head against the woman's chin. He had that old cozy smell that the house did. Mrs. Howe made for the front door, shuffling along in her black gown. Audrey glanced at the clock. There were only minutes left until dawn. She leaned forward so that she could see out into the foyer. The door opened, welcoming in the last of October's cool exhaltations. A small child stood on the porch. She was so unnaturally thin that her faded bunny suit hung on her frame like the skin of a hound. Flaxen braids framed the mask, and she looked up at the old woman through its hollow eyes. The girl held out a pale hand, and Mrs. Howe took it. Stepping outside with her, out into the leaves and faded darkness. Basil perked, turning toward the breeze. It occurred to Audrey at last, as she sat stroking his dark fur, that Basil had died in his sleep many years before. The cat gave a meow and leapt down, pattering across the room, through the hallway, and out, behind Mrs. Howe and the little girl. The door swung shut. Audrey sat by the fireplace, a smile on her lips, as the first flush of dawn illuminated the lacy frost on the living room windows. "Happy Halloween," she whispered. And again, that's a story called Halloween Tea by Scott Thomas, and it is in Over the Darkening Fields. There we go. So, Scott, thank you for letting me read these stories tonight. Thanks to everyone for spending part of your Tuesday with me. And yeah, this entire time, Jupiter has not moved. Hey, buddy, you are just out, aren't you? Food coma. He and Jupiter had their supper right before this. Speaking of Jupiter, where'd he go? Well, he's got to be in here somewhere. Hey, hope you guys enjoyed the tour of the book house, my office. If you didn't see it, it's on this YouTube channel. Just scroll down to the book house playlist, actually. So, anyway, yeah, that's probably my second favorite in the book. Winter Census, of course, being my favorite. And thanks, Scott. Um, if you have not read The Sea of Ash by Scott Thomas, you should get it right away. Seriously, I'm not kidding. It is a novella, so it's not a long read. Actually, many people have reviewed it and said that they wish there was more because they enjoyed it so much. So check it out. If you like this kind of horror, this quiet horror, New England horror, you'll love The Sea of Ash, and you'll love the other stories in Over the Darkening Fields. So yeah, check it out and do me a favor. If you do, shoot me an email and let me know that you enjoyed it. I'll pass them on to Scott. So lovecrafteasing@gmail.com. Oh wow, you own it in 3 formats? Oh, The Sea of Ash. Yeah, I was thinking Over the Darkening Fields only has one. Yeah, if you're an audio book person, I publish The Sea of Ash. And usually you might think that I'm saying you need to read The Sea of Ash because I published it. Actually, the reverse is true. I published it because I loved it so much. And there in the introduction, no, excuse me, in the afterword by Scott's brother Jeff, it gives you a history of how all of this happened. But several years ago, man, time flies. I hired Lehman Kessler to do an audible narration, and he did a fantastic job. And it's one of those books where if you read the book, you'll love it, and if you listen to it, then it has an added dimension, you know, because someone's reading it to you. So anyway, guys, thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting me. Especially thanks to all of the patrons who are given 5, 10, whatever bucks a month to keep this going and to keep this community going. And to get some extra fun Patreon stuff too. So anyway, Scott, I'll talk to you soon. Everybody else, I hope you have a wonderful night, and I will see you Thursday at 11 p.m. Eastern time, right here. Same bat time. No, different bat time. It's an hour later. Same bat channel. Have a good night, everyone.